The morning light filtered weakly through my small apartment window, landing on the old photograph that had become both my comfort and my torment. It was a picture from 40 years ago, me, my late wife, and our tiny daughter at the park. I still remember that day. Laughter, the smell of cotton candy, her hand clutching mine. That memory was once my strength. Now, it was a reminder of everything I'd lost. At 75, people told me I should be proud just to be alive, that I should rest, enjoy my pension, and let the world spin without me. But every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see an old man ready to fade away. I saw someone who had given up too much, too early dreams, ambitions, and the fire to live for something more. My daughter, Claire, meant well when she'd call every weekend, reminding me to take my pills and not overdo it. But beneath her concern was something else, pity. That quiet tone people use when they've already decided your story is over. I wasn't always like this, a man staring at walls and watching the days blend together. I used to build houses, strong ones, with my own hands. I could work from sunrise to sunset without feeling tired. Back then, people respected me for what I could create. Now, I couldn't even convince my landlord to fix a leaky faucet. It wasn't the physical weakness that hurt the most. It was the invisibility. That morning, as the sunlight warmed my face, something inside me shifted a quiet defiance that had been sleeping for too long. I didn't know it then, but that day would be the start of everything. The day I decided that age wasn't a wall, just a number carved by time. The knock on my door startled me. It was Mrs. Jensen, the landlord's assistant, her young face framed by impatience. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "you really need to think about moving. The owner's planning to renovate this building and—" I cut her off with a faint smile. "Renovate, huh? That means tear down what's left of people like me." She frowned, unsure how to respond. "You'll get compensation," she said, voice softening a little, "but you can't stay here past next month." When she left, I sat back in my chair and exhaled. That apartment had been my home for over 20 years. Every crack in the wall had a story. Losing it felt like losing another piece of myself. But maybe, I thought, this was life's way of forcing me to move literally and metaphorically. That night, I couldn't sleep. I watched the lights flicker from the street below, listened to the city hum. Somewhere between the sound of distant laughter and car horns, a strange calm came over me. I got up, grabbed an old notebook, and started writing down everything I'd once dreamed of doing but never had the courage to try. It felt foolish at first, like a child scribbling fantasies. But as the list grew, my heart began to race. Build something with my hands again. Travel to the coast. Start a business, even a small one. Forgive myself for all the wasted years. I paused at that last one. Forgiveness. That was the hardest part. I'd spent decades blaming myself for not being there when my wife got sick, for letting work consume everything. Claire was only 10 when her mother passed, and I'd buried my guilt in construction projects until I had nothing left but regrets. The next morning, I went for a walk through the park, the same one from that old photograph. Kids were playing, joggers passed by, and couples laughed on benches. I could almost feel my wife beside me whispering, "You're still here, Robert. You still have time." Her voice, or maybe my memory of it, stirred something in me that no medicine could fix. That afternoon, I made a decision. I pulled out the old toolbox from the closet and started cleaning it. The hammer was rusted, the measuring tape stiff, but they felt familiar in my hands. For the first time in years, I felt alive, not because of nostalgia, but because I was about to start something again. 2 days later, I visited a small hardware store downtown. The young clerk looked surprised when I asked about renting workshop space. "Sir," he said politely, "those units are mostly for contractors or younger builders. It's kind of heavy work." I smiled. "Son, the weight of regret is heavier than any beam I'll ever lift." He grinned awkwardly, but handed me the brochure anyway. By the end of the week, I'd rented a tiny shed behind the store. Dusty, cold, but full of possibility. My plan was simple. Build handcrafted furniture from reclaimed wood. Nothing fancy. Just something real, something made by my hands again. The first few days were rough. My joints ached, and I nearly gave up when I couldn't saw through a thick piece of oak. But the smell of wood, the sound of the blade, the way the sunlight hit the dust in the air, it reminded me why I'd loved this craft in the first place. I wasn't building just furniture. I was rebuilding myself. The days turned into weeks, and slowly that little shed became my world. Every morning, I'd open the door and breathe in the scent of sawdust and fresh paint. It was messy, unglamorous work, but it gave me purpose. The first chair I built wasn't perfect. The legs wobbled and the varnish dried unevenly, but when I stepped back and looked at it, I smiled for the first time in a long time. It was proof that I could still make something, that I wasn't just a relic of the past. One afternoon as I was sanding down a tabletop, I heard a voice behind me. "You're really doing this, huh?" It was Claire. She stood at the door, holding her phone like a shield, wearing that worried expression I'd seen since the day her mother died. "Dad, this isn't safe. You're 75. You should be relaxing, not." I put down the sandpaper and turned to her. "Not what? Not living?" She blinked, caught off guard. "That's not what I mean. Claire," I interrupted gently. "I spent half my life working for others, and the other half waiting for something to change. If this is how I spend the time I have left, I'd say it's a good trade." She sighed, looking around at the piles of wood and tools. "You could get hurt. You don't even have insurance for this kind of thing." I chuckled softly. "You sound just like your mother when I started our first house. She told me I'd break my back before I finished the foundation. I guess she was right, but we still built that home, didn't we?" Her eyes softened for a moment. She didn't say anything, but I saw her lips curve into a faint smile. "You're impossible," she muttered before leaving, but I could tell there was something different in her tone, maybe a hint of pride buried under all that worry. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat outside the shed, sipping tea from a chipped mug. My hands were sore, my back ached, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. I thought about all the people who said it was too late to start over the doctors, my friends at the senior center, even the voice in my own head. But I realized something. The only time it's too late is when you stop believing you can begin again. The next morning, a man stopped by while I was polishing the new table I'd made. "You sell these?" he asked. He was middle-aged, dressed in paint, stained jeans, probably another craftsman. "Not yet," I said. "I just build them for myself." He ran his hand over the table's surface, whistling softly. "You should. There's a market for real woodwork these days, not this factory junk." That night, I couldn't sleep. The man's words kept echoing in my head. Maybe I could sell them not for money, but to share something real. So I took a photo of the table, uploaded it to an online marketplace, and titled it simply, "Handcrafted by a 5-year-old who refuses to stop building." I didn't expect anything to happen, but the next morning my phone buzzed with a message. "Is this still available?" Then another, and another. By noon, the table was sold. The woman who bought it, a young artist named Mia, insisted on picking it up herself. When she arrived, she looked around in awe. "You made all these?" she asked. "Every nail and splinter," I said proudly. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "You know, my grandfather used to make furniture. Looking at these feels like home." Her words hit me deeper than she knew. That night, I sat staring at the empty space where the table had been and realized something incredible. I hadn't just built furniture. I'd built a connection. From then on, orders started coming more frequently. A chair here, a bookshelf there. People seemed drawn not just to the craftsmanship, but to the story behind it. One day, Mia called me again. "Mr. Reynolds, would you be willing to share your work at our community art fair next month? It's all about creative expression at any age." I hesitated. The thought of standing in front of strangers made my stomach twist. But then I remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to have the world assume you were done. And I wasn't done. Not yet. So I said yes. The month leading up to the fair was exhausting but exhilarating. I poured every ounce of strength into creating pieces that meant something: a rocking chair inspired by my wife's favorite one, a small wooden box engraved with the words "Begin Again," and a table carved with the initials of every person who had ever encouraged me. The day of the fair arrived. Claire drove me there, still skeptical but supportive. As we unloaded the pieces, she looked at the crowd forming around other booths. "Dad, if this gets too much, just let me know, okay?" I nodded, smiling. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I've faced tougher crowds." When the fair opened, people started stopping by. Some admired the craftsmanship. Others asked about the story behind it. But what struck me most was how many older visitors lingered, their eyes lighting up as they touched the wood, as if my story gave them permission to dream again. A man in his 60s leaned over and said, "You're brave for doing this. I've been wanting to start painting again, but my kids keep telling me I'm too old for that nonsense." I grinned. "Then it's time to remind them who taught them to dream in the first place." By the end of the day, all my pieces were sold. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was the way people looked at me. Not as a fragile old man, but as someone alive, creating, still fighting. As we packed up, Claire hugged me. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think Mom would be proud." My throat tightened. "I hope so," I whispered. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized this wasn't just about furniture. It was about reclaiming the years I thought were gone, proving that starting over wasn't a last act, but a new beginning. The week after, the fair felt like stepping into a new life. I woke up each morning, not out of habit, but out of excitement. The shed that once smelled of rust and neglect now buzzed with life half-finished chairs, new orders stacked on my workbench, and a small calendar pinned to the wall marking delivery dates. For the first time in years, I felt the rhythm of purpose beating inside me again. But as life tends to do, it tested that purpose just when I thought I had everything under control. It started with the pain in my right hand. At first, it was a dull ache I ignored, assuming it was just fatigue. But within days, my fingers began to tremble when I held the chisel. One afternoon, as I was carving a chair leg, my hand slipped, and the tool grazed my palm, drawing blood. I cursed under my breath, wrapped it with an old cloth, and sat down. The shed was quiet, except for the faint hum of the city beyond its walls. I stared at my shaking hand and felt a cold fear creep in. What if this was it? What if the very thing that gave me purpose was being taken away again? The next morning, I went to the clinic. The doctor, a young man barely older than my grandson, examined my hand carefully. "It's arthritis," he said gently, "common at your age, especially for someone who's used their hands for physical work most of their life." I nodded, pretending to take it well, but inside, I felt like the world was collapsing again. "Will it get better?" I asked. He hesitated. "It can be managed, but it's progressive. Try to rest your hands as much as you can." Rest. That word stung like an insult. Rest was just another word for stopping. When I returned home, I sat on the porch for hours, staring at my hands, the same hands that had built homes, raised a family, and now built a new life. They looked old, veined, marked with scars, but they were still mine. I wasn't ready to give up on them yet. The next day, I went back to the shed. My grip was weaker, and I had to move slower, but I kept working. I started experimenting with smaller projects, things that didn't require heavy lifting. Jewelry boxes, picture frames, tiny carved birds that I gave to the neighborhood kids who stopped by to watch me work. One afternoon, I noticed a small group of them gathered outside the shed. 3 boys and a girl, all around 10 or 11. "Mister," one of them asked, "can you show us how to make those birds?" Their eyes were bright with curiosity, the same spark I used to see in my daughter's eyes when she was that age. I smiled. "All right," I said, "but only if you promise not to chop off any fingers." They laughed, and I handed each of them a piece of soft pine and a dull carving knife. For the next hour, the shed was filled with laughter and chatter. Their birds came out lopsided and funny-looking, but they were proud of them. When they left, the smallest girl turned back and said, "You should teach more people, mister. You're really good at it." That night, her words stuck with me. Maybe my hands couldn't build houses anymore, but they could still teach others how to create. The following week, I went to the community center and proposed an idea, a woodworking class for seniors and kids. The director, a kind woman named Rosa, looked at me skeptically. "You want to teach? At your age?" I grinned. "That's the best part. If I can do it, they'll have no excuse not to." A month later, my first class began. There were 6 seniors and 4 kids. The seniors were shy at first, hesitant to touch the tools, afraid of making mistakes. But as the days passed, the air filled with the smell of wood and the sound of laughter. People who had spent years feeling forgotten were suddenly alive again, sanding, carving, and sharing stories. One of the students, an old man named George, said something that stayed with me. "You didn't just teach me how to carve wood, Robert. You taught me how to carve out a reason to wake up again." Those words made me realize this journey was never about starting a business. It was about starting over. in every sense of the word. Claire visited one weekend and saw the class in full swing. She stood at the doorway, eyes wide as she watched a group of seniors proudly showing off their small creations. When the class ended, she pulled me aside. "Dad," she said softly, this is incredible. You've built more than furniture. You've built a community." I smiled. Guess it's never too late to build something that lasts. For the first time in decades, Claire and I didn't argue. We sat together outside the shed, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. She rested her head on my shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. "You were right," she whispered. "It's not too late, is it?" "Never is," I said. "The only thing that ever runs out is the courage to try again." As the months went by, the class grew. Local newspapers wrote small stories about the old carpenter who refused to quit. People came from nearby towns to learn, to talk, or simply to be reminded that life could still surprise them. One day, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the city council, inviting me to speak at a senior empowerment event. The irony made me chuckle. A year ago, I was invisible. Now, people wanted to hear my story. When I stood on that stage weeks later, my hands trembled not from arthritis this time, but from emotion. I looked out at the sea of faces, young, old, curious, hopeful, and said, "They told me I was too old to start over. But age isn't what stops us. Fear does. And fear is something you can unlearn." The crowd applauded, but the real victory was the peace in my heart. I had proven something to myself, something deeper than pride, that the human spirit doesn't fade with time. It just waits for the right spark to reignite it. After the speech, life took on a new rhythm. I wasn't just Robert the old carpenter anymore. I had become something else, a teacher, a storyteller, a reminder to others that broken things, whether made of wood or heart, can always be repaired. But with every high point in life comes a shadow, and mine came quietly, one morning in late spring. I woke up to find an envelope slipped under my door. It was from my son, David, the one who hadn't spoken to me since the fight over the house 2 years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The handwriting was familiar yet hesitant, the way guilt often looks on paper. "Dad," it began, "I heard about what you're doing. Someone shared a video of your speech online. I watched it 3 times. I'm sorry for everything. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want to see you. I miss you." I sat there for a long time, staring at the letter. My heart was heavy with a mix of relief, anger, and longing. It's strange you spend years wishing someone would apologize, and when they finally do, you realize forgiveness isn't as simple as saying, "I accept." Still, I knew this was a moment that mattered. I called him that evening. When his voice came through, it was cautious. "Dad?" "Yes," I said. "It's me." There was a pause, then a shaky laugh. "You sound good." "I am," I replied. "Better than I've been in years." We spoke for over an hour, about small things at first, the weather, the old neighborhood, the dog he had when he was a kid. But slowly, the walls began to crumble. He admitted he'd been ashamed, that when his business failed and I offered to help, his pride got in the way. "Selling my house without asking me," he said, "was the stupidest thing I've ever done." I told him I wasn't angry anymore. "You did what you thought was right at the time," I said. "But life has a way of humbling all of us." He asked if he could visit, and a week later, he did. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him, a few more lines on his face, a tired look in his eyes. But when we hugged, the years melted away. We spent the afternoon walking through my workshop. He ran his hand along a half-finished chair and smiled faintly. "You really did it, huh?" "Did what?" I asked. "Proved everyone wrong." I chuckled. "I wasn't trying to prove anything, I was just trying to live." That evening, we sat outside the shed, the same way Claire and I had months earlier. David looked at the sunset and said, "You know, I used to think success was about money. Now I see it's about meaning." I nodded. "You learn that when you lose both and have to rebuild." He stayed for dinner that night, and for the first time in decades, my house felt full again, laughter, clinking dishes, stories that filled the silence of too many lonely years. In the following weeks, David started joining my woodworking classes. He didn't have the same steady hand I did, but he had curiosity, and that was enough. The seniors adored him, a younger man among them, learning with humility. He even started helping Rosa manage the community center's finances, using the business skills that once brought him down. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with quiet admiration. "You didn't just start over, Dad," he said one day. "You built a second life." I smiled. "And you're part of it now. That's the best part." But life, once again, wasn't done teaching me lessons. One afternoon after class, Rosa came up to me. "Robert, the local news station wants to do a segment on you about your story, your classes, your impact. Would you be willing to do an interview?" The idea made me nervous. I'd never liked cameras. But then I thought of all the people who might need to hear that it's never too late to start again. So I agreed. The interview aired a week later, titled, "The Man Who Proved 75 is Just the Beginning." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from people across the country, retirees, widows, even teenagers who felt lost. They all said the same thing. "Your story gave me hope." One letter stood out. It was from a woman named Eleanor. She wrote, "I'm 80 years old, and my husband passed last year. I thought my life was over until I watched you speak. You reminded me that living isn't just about surviving, it's about daring to start again." I sat there reading her words over and over, realizing that the ripples of one small decision to try again can travel farther than you ever imagine. Weeks later, Eleanor showed up at one of my classes. A small woman with bright eyes and a cane. She smiled shyly as she said, "You're the man who made me believe in tomorrow again." We became fast friends. She had stories that could fill libraries, tales of love, loss, and quiet strength. Sometimes we'd sit in silence, sanding wood side by side, and that silence said more than words ever could. As the months rolled by, my life once empty and quiet became a mosaic of faces, laughter, and stories. And I realized something beautiful. Starting over wasn't about reclaiming the past. It was about embracing the present. The arthritis still flared up sometimes, reminding me that time always leaves its mark. But every ache was a reminder of how far I'd come from a man who'd lost everything to one who'd found meaning again. One evening, as I was locking up the shed, David approached me with a mischievous smile. "What if we made this bigger, Dad? Like a real foundation? Workshops in other towns? Maybe even an online channel? You've got a story people want to hear." I laughed. "Me? Online?" He nodded. "Why not? If you can start over at 75, you can learn YouTube at 76. I thought about it for a moment. Then I smiled. "All right, let's give it a shot. But you're doing the typing." We both laughed, and in that laughter was everything redemption, healing, and the simple joy of beginning again. That night, as I sat on the porch, I realized something profound. People talk about second chances like they're rare. But in truth, life offers them every day, in every sunrise, every apology, every new beginning. We just have to be brave enough to take them. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd ever imagined at 75. David set up the channel, designed the logo, and handled the technical side while I focused on what I knew best, storytelling through wood. He recorded me carving, teaching, laughing with students, and talking about life. We didn't try to make it fancy. It was simple, honest, and human. The first video went live on a quiet Sunday afternoon. We titled it, "It's Never Too Late to Begin Again." It was just me sitting on a stool in my workshop, telling my story how I'd lost everything, how I'd thought life was over, and how I found purpose again with a piece of wood and a little courage. When I went to bed that night, the video had a few dozen views. By the next morning, it had thousands. Comments poured in from people all over the world. Watching this made me call my dad after 10 years. "I'm 60 and afraid to start my art again. You just changed that." "You made me cry, sir. Thank you for reminding me life doesn't end with wrinkles." David read the comments out loud, his voice trembling with pride. "Dad, they love you. You're changing lives." I smiled softly. "No, son, they're changing mine." Weeks turned into months, and our little channel became something bigger. People started sending stories of their own letters, drawings, even photos of things they'd built after watching me. We began featuring them in our videos, calling it the Maker's Circle. It wasn't about fame. It was about connection. I often thought back to the man I was before all this, tired, bitter, sitting in an empty house, believing time had beaten me. And I'd smile, realizing that life hadn't taken anything from me that I couldn't rebuild with my own two hands. One afternoon, I was teaching a class when I noticed Claire standing at the back, watching quietly. After everyone left, She approached me, holding a small wooden box. "I made this," she said shyly. "Watched your videos and followed along." I opened it. Inside was a tiny carving of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing beneath a tree. My eyes stung with tears. "It's us," she whispered. "Before everything fell apart. Before we forgot what mattered." I hugged her tightly. "We didn't forget," I said. "We just needed to remember in a new way." Later that night, the 3 of us, me, Claire, and David, sat together for dinner. There was laughter, old jokes, even gentle teasing. For the first time in decades, the space around that table felt whole again. After they left, I walked out to the porch and looked up at the stars. The air was cool, and the scent of sawdust still clung to my clothes. I thought about all the years I had wasted believing that growing old meant fading away. But age, I realized, doesn't steal your dreams. It only tests how deeply you believe in them. The next morning, a letter arrived. This one wasn't from a fan, it was from the local university. They were offering me an honorary award for inspiring lifelong learning and community impact. Me, a man who barely finished high school. At the ceremony, when they handed me the plaque, I didn't feel pride in the usual way. I felt gratitude. Gratitude for every mistake, every heartbreak, every wrong turn, because each one had led me here, to a moment that proved it's never too late to matter. When I spoke to the crowd that day, I said, "You don't stop living when you grow old. You stop living when you stop learning, loving, and daring." I thought my story ended at 75. Turns out, it was just the start of a new chapter. The room erupted in applause, but what I remember most wasn't the noise. It was the sight of David and Claire in the front row, clapping with tears in their eyes. After the ceremony, David took my hand and said, "You know, Dad, you didn't just start over. You taught us how to." Claire nodded. "You showed us that strength doesn't mean never falling. It means rising, even when the world expects you to stay down." That night, back home, I walked into my workshop and ran my hand over the wood grain of an unfinished table. Every mark, every dent, every scratch told a story. So did I. As I looked around, I realized the shed wasn't just a place of work anymore. It was a symbol of renewal, of faith, of the stubborn beauty of beginning again. I sat down, picked up a small block of wood, and began carving slowly, carefully, each stroke deliberate. It didn't matter that my hands shook now and then. What mattered was that they still worked, still created, still held purpose. While I carved, I whispered softly to myself, almost like a prayer, "It's never too late." The camera on the corner of the bench was still on. David had left it recording earlier. It captured everything. The creak of the stool, the rasp of the chisel, and the quiet voice of a man who refused to fade. That video became one of our most watched uploads. People said it felt like sitting with their own father or grandfather, listening to the quiet wisdom of time. They said it made them believe again, not in miracles, but in effort, persistence, and heart. And maybe that's what life really is. Not a race to finish early, but a slow carving, patient, imperfect, beautiful in its own rhythm. As I put away my tools that night, I caught my reflection in the window. Wrinkled, yes. Old, yes. But behind those lines, there was something new, a man reborn. Not in years, but in purpose. I turned off the light, closed the workshop door, and whispered one last time before heading inside, "Tomorrow, I'll make something new." And I did, every single day that followed.